isn't free. It costs folks like you and me. And if we don't all chip in, we'll never pay that bill. Freedom isn't free. No, there's a hefty thugging fee. And if you don't throw in your bucko five, who will?
And welcome to the final part of our four-stage discussion of non-democratic theories. And this one is probably the most democratic out of all of them. In fact, I'd even go so far as to say that there is a large tint of democracy in theories of populism. A little bit less national populism, but one nonetheless that I include in this half of class rather than the first. And I'm pretty certain that you have heard of this term populism before. It is now become a veritable buzzword for establishment media and their pundits to describe any political movement that challenges the status quo. And, they're not entirely wrong with that. But there's a little bit more to populism than just simply a few dismissive and derogatory terms. Obviously, the two people that you see here represent two different approaches to populism. And while I am very, very hesitant to find similarities between Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, the one thing that both of them agree on, at least as far as their policies, and Bernie, I think, really believes this, and Trump just does it for the lulz. But both the Bernie and Trump movements, definitely in 2016, they ran their campaigns on voter frustration to the neoliberal status quo. And, that's why, Hillary was just, so beleaguered on both sides, because, she's coming to represent a movement that is no longer working for the average citizen. And this is something that, leads one to be worried about populism, because more often than not, ladies and gentlemen, populism in the current political situation almost always gravitates towards national populism rather than the old classic populism. And it is national populism that is much more authoritarian and far more illiberal than the more classic agrarian populism of someone like Bernie Sanders or Jeremy Corbyn. So, let's unpack all of this and, finish up before we get to our case studies. Now, the first thing I want to do is give you a little overview of the electoral map that fateful November evening in 2016. Now, I don't know if you were paying attention back then. I'm pretty certain that if you are seniors, you probably were, and you were shocked to find that Trump won. I gotta tell you, and for those of you who know me, I was laughing my butt off that night. Not because I voted for Trump, but because I knew that Hillary was in trouble. I knew that she was in trouble because she ran not just a lackluster campaign, but, and here is the big lesson for today's discussion, you don't defend the status quo with platitudes and empty phrases when your opponent is operating on a type of organized rage against the status quo. And, when you look at the map here, you see that Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Iowa are striped in red. And these are states that Trump won in 2016 that went to Obama in 2012. Okay? So these are states that he flipped. These are states also that were slated to go to Hillary, but in enormous electoral upsets that evening. All of the forecasts, all of the exit polls, all of the pundits on TV, Nate Silver on 538.com, were absolutely convinced that Hillary was going to knock this out of the park. There was just no way that Trump was going to win. And then we find that, he flipped Iowa and that he got Florida. And then all of a sudden he picked up North Carolina. And then, just to make matters worse, he got Michigan and Wisconsin. And and I remember I'm watching this with my wife, and it's like 10:30 at night, and I'm doing the math, and I'm like, he's got this. Like, there's no way that she can get out of this. Like, she needs a miracle in Ohio or Pennsylvania. But even with that, with the loss of Michigan and Wisconsin, there's no way that she could make up the math, right? I mean, the West Coast had not yet closed. That's, Washington, Oregon, and California. Now, these states almost always go Democratic. Like, these are hardcore blue states, right? So even if she got those, there was no way that she was going to be able to get the math in. And of course, the next day and the following week, people were like, what the hell happened? What the hell happened? And what happened is that Trump tapped into white working class voter anger. And many of these people voted for Sanders in the primary, but were absolutely opposed to voting for Hillary in the general. So they defected to Trump because at the time, he's talking about, making America great again and restoring the working party, the working class, and lowering taxes and blah, 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 right? So he taps into working class anger. And this is probably one of the reasons why populism is so, popular today. And if you look around the world here, and I'm including Europe, Western Europe, Central Europe, Eastern Europe as well, populist parties are winning election after election. And the reason behind that is because there is a growing voter frustration with free market fundamentalism and, by extension, the status quo of neoliberalism. And in the absence of any real social democratic left-wing movement, voter frustration is going to be channeled, either willingly or exploitatively, by the right. And herein lies where much of the discussion of populism fits within the category of illiberal to even non-democratic practices. Okay? So when we talk about populism, whether it is the original or the new amended national populism, okay, we have to understand that populism in general can be understood as a type of democracy that works outside conventional political structures. Right? This is key. A type of democracy that operates outside conventional political structures. It's a type of reactionary democracy against what its adherents believe to be abuses of power by state organs. Okay? So populism is reactionary in the sense that it is reacting to a collectively perceived problem, whether it's political, economic, social, or cultural, but almost always a combination of two or more of them. Usually socioeconomic is one thing that galvanizes populist movements. And so in that case, populism is a rage from below with a progressive agenda. Now, I put progressive in lowercase p, not uppercase, because progressive in this sense means that populism seeks remedies to the problem that are not conventional, that are not status quo oriented, but a progressive agenda that seeks some type of structural, institutional change. So it's not just simply putting a Band-Aid on something that is wounded, but getting rid of it altogether and replacing it with something entirely new. Now, historically speaking, folks, populism originally was an element of the political left. Okay? And when I say originally, we're talking about late 19th, early 20th century, right? And it was a movement of the left. But in the last 25 to 30 years, maybe even 20 years, this type of populism has been successfully appropriated, manipulated, and distorted by the right. In fact, this is probably one of the most successful cases of political development, even beyond hybrid regimes, right? Hybrid regimes, once again, are just there to keep the people in power. Populism, right-wing populism, has a mobilizing, targeted goal for the state. There is an ideology that goes into it. A hybrid regime might hide behind an ideology, but no. National populism is something that uses ideology for its end. And in that case, national populism, and this is the term that we're really going to be focusing on in this class, it takes the general features of populism, just what we just talked about, but places it 90 degrees, right? It kind of, shifts it 90 degrees and places the idea, the us versus them, the righteous versus the damned, within an ethnocentric and state-centric viewpoint. So whereas classical populism kind of saw the battle between, let's say, the agrarians versus the industrialists, or the working class versus the bourgeois, or Main Street versus Wall Street, or the family versus the corporation, right? You kind of get the idea, right? National populism still takes that Manichaean us versus them, but uses whole ethnic groups as good versus bad. So it's, whites versus minorities, Hungarians versus gypsies, Turks versus Kurds, French versus Algerians, Croats versus Serbs, right? You get the idea, right? And this has become a very successful tool of the right, not just in the developing world, but even more so in the advanced industrialized countries. So, Donald Trump is a definite spokesman for national populism. I don't know what he really believes. I think that he may just see this as a way of increasing his own power. Trump would be great as a hybrid regime leader and, give the nature of Biden stumbling and bumbling his way towards nomination, we're going to get Trump for another 4 years. I hate to be the downer, but, that's just unfortunately where we are unless things change. But Trump definitely knows how to tap into this. He definitely knows how to tap into this, especially with his whole "Make America Great," slogan again, because that's a fantastic slogan. Make America great again. Again is the most important part of those 4 words, which implies that America was at one point great, but had lost its way. And Trump is going to restore that. Now, what is it that he's restoring? He's restoring white supremacy. Not neo-Nazi white supremacy, but he's restoring a type of white-dominant, traditional-oriented, middle America type of political culture that may have never really existed, but one that, has been championed and romanticized ever since Bill Clinton took office in 1992. Nigel Farage is a great example of a national populist leader in the United Kingdom with his whole United Kingdom Independence Party. This type of populism very successfully led to Brexit a few years ago. Viktor Orban, the top-heavy strongman of Hungary, is actually a prime minister, not a president, but Orban has been extraordinarily successul in channeling Hungarian nativism, in a country that is, like 93% Hungarian, but using the fear of being overrun by gypsies and Muslims and immigrants and secularists and whatever it is, he uses national populism as a way of securing his own vote and kind of consolidating a particular political culture of faith, family, and fatherland. Same thing goes for Marine Le Pen, the head of the National Front Party of France. Her father ran the party for a number of years. In fact, he was, I believe, at a very young age, I think he was a Nazi collaborator in the Second World War. No, Marie is not young either, but she is repeatedly the head of the second largest and second most popular political party in France. And there's many people that are saying it's no longer a matter of if, but when Le Pen comes to power in France. And even though she's no longer a mainstay in, American news and whatever it is, Sarah Palin, as I lovingly used to refer to her as Caribou Barbie, was probably one of the first progenitors of this type of populism. She kind of comes onto the scene, sort of haphazardly chosen by John McCain to be his running mate in 2008. You couldn't have picked a worse candidate to come up with. I mean, the woman is just, I'm sorry, she's just an idiot. But she does have a following. And she loves to use her, what she believes is the down-to-earth, hokey-pokey, middle America, conservative American that, knows liberal bullshit when you see it type of thing, right? So, national populism is not just necessarily authoritarianism, and it's not even overt racism. It's a type of ideology that seeks to speak to people who feel that they have been ignored, overlooked, ridiculed, and dismissed. This stems from the original agrarian populist model, which I feel we need to look at before we compare that with national populism. And, sort of the original agrarian concept of populism is a class-based distinction, as I had just said briefly beforehand, between agrarian sectors of the countryside and the industrial and intellectual classes of the urban centers, right? So it's town versus country, or in this case, country versus town. Farmer versus industrialist, right? Homegrown America versus the decadence of the city. And, this later evolves into some kind of working class social democracy where, populism is no longer just an agrarian thing, but it does provide somewhat of an urban atmosphere. But the urban elements of this type of populism is still very class-based, right? It's working classes, it's unions, it's the, the Teamsters, it's the Jimmy Hoffas that are railing against, the corrupt industrial management that is constantly, shitting on the everyday man. Right? It's constantly trying to keep the working class down, that's trying to prevent us from putting food on the table, money in our pockets, and just leading a normal everyday life, right? So there is a rather Marxist element about original populism between the haves and the have-nots. And so, it's not a surprise that this original populism responds to, perceptions of large-scale capitalism, especially as money and investments are constantly going more and more towards the cities and rural communities are, becoming neglected and abandoned. There's no investment. There's no help for the farmer. There's no help for the agrarian sector. It's a way of trying to, preserve the small family farms, the little mom and pop shops, right? The little, it's a movement for the little guy, basically. A movement for the little guy against the, the caricature of the old dude with the top hat and the monocle from Monopoly. So, this type of populism actively works to defend workers' rights and local self-government, and kind of looks at the peasantry, whether it's the farmer or the working class, the proletariat, mind you, as the foundation of the economy. So there is something very Marxist about agrarian populism, right? We are the builders, we are the farmers, we are the workers that make this country what it is. We are the foundation upon which the skyscrapers and capitalism is built on. And without us, you guys are nothing. So this very Manichaean us versus them, we're the morally good, you're the decadent bad, is carried over into this new form of national populism that I have to say really begins in the 1990s. Right? It really begins in I would say, maybe about the mid-90s, something like that, right? And this Manichaean divide continues. However, the distinction is no longer class-based, but ethnic-based, between the true members of the community and the disloyal. Okay? The ordinary people versus the privileged elites, and even more so, the true rightful members of the state, the true members of the nation, and the foreigners. So in addition to dividing up between, let's say, the people that love their country and the people that are trying to sell the country out to globalization, there also is a clear divide between us and non-group members, right? Minorities, minority religions, minority cultures, minority ethnicities, minority languages, whatever it happens to be. So there was a clear display of xenophobia, ethnocentrism, and anti-globalism that goes into this amended national populism. Okay? This right-wing neo-populism that is permeating many beleaguered democracies around the world, including this one, right? Including this one. Like their agrarian predecessors, national populist parties speak of returning power to the people and restoring traditional values and principles, essentially making your country great again, right? Nothing could be more clear in a populist message than the whole MAGA element of Trump. I don't know who came up with that slogan, but I've said so in other classes. It is the most ingenious slogan of modern American political culture. Say what you want about Trump, say what you want about his movement, say what you want about his voters, but nothing gets the people more energized than that. Make America great again. It means nothing, but it allows you to get creative with your imagination. And it testifies about returning power to the people and restoring traditional values and principles. Values and principles that are continuously threatened by secular progressivism, immigration, globalization, cosmopolitanism, all sorts of liberal crap, right? So you know how you've got that one Trump voter, or you probably got a Trump relative, or maybe you are a Trump voter. Who the hell knows? I don't really care. But you know how they constantly love to use the word liberal as almost like a racial slur, right? Because liberal for them, or socialist for them, or left for them, is everything that is representative of the things that are targeting America, right? So national populists, oh, they are big defenders of faith, family, and fatherland, the 3 Fs, absolutely. And they feel that if we don't defend faith, family, and fatherland, then secular progressivism, political correctness, gender fluidity, all forms of, toleration here, there, and wherever is just going to destroy the foundations of the country to the point where we lose our way, we lose our identity, we lose what's important, and we just become, just another mess in that sense. So, as a way of differentiating between the two one more time, right? And, this is probably one of the most important elements of this, is that agrarian populism, the original concept of agrarian populism, views conflicts as sociological between horizontally based class structures. National populism, on the other hand, looks at conflict between vertically based ethnic communities. Okay? This is the difference. The original agrarian populism views conflict as sociological between horizontally based class structures. This is Bernie Sanders. This is Jeremy Corbyn. National populism views conflict between vertically based ethnic communities. This is Donald Trump. This is Nigel Farage. This is Viktor Orban. This is Marie Le Pen. Okay? The national populism is much more illiberal and much more of a threat to the status quo, even though national populism has absolutely no problem maintaining the economic status quo. National populism is totally fine with free market capitalism. They just want to deny capitalistic benefits and social welfare to non-group members. Okay? And what are some examples around the world to give you an idea? Right? Now, many of these parties I'm going to assume you're unfamiliar with. The Austrian Freedom Party is one that we talked about in the beginning of the semester, if you remember. Right? Remember back in 2000, there were elections in Austria, and the FPO won a plurality. And it shocked most of Europe because it is considered a right-wing, xenophobic, nationalistic party. At the time, its party leader, Jörg Haider, who has since died, praised the work ethic of Nazi Germany. And it's like, well, yeah, Hitler did put a lot of people to work, but at what cost? They're still around today, and they are very prominent at the local levels, and they are very much in favor of promoting this type of Austria for the Austrians. The Swiss People's Party. You think to yourself, Switzerland? Really? Switzerland's a very conservative country. Switzerland is overwhelmingly conservative. What makes the Swiss People's Party stand out, and this was a long time ago, this is probably more than 10 years ago, but Switzerland is one of the very few countries that actually is a direct democracy. So like the people, the citizens, they vote on everything. If there's an issue that comes up, the ballots and the points, yes or no or whatever, they're all mailed to everybody's house. And, you vote on it, you stick it back in an envelope, into the mail, and off it goes. In Switzerland's case, there was an issue a couple of years ago that revolved around the issue of minarets on mosques. Now, for those of you that don't know what a minaret is, the minaret is that little tower that stands next to a mosque where there's a little guy that goes all the way up to the top, right? Little, it looks like a pencil, right? And he issues the call to prayer, right? Churches have bell towers and steeples, and mosques have minarets. Now, there's multiple mosques throughout Switzerland. There's only 4 in the entire country that actually have full-blown minarets. And the issue was, should more mosques have minarets? And, there's a big campaign throughout the country, and those saying yes because of freedom of religion and integration, blah, blah, blah. And then there were those that were saying no. And the reason why they were saying no is because minarets just, blemish the skyline of Switzerland, And it's bad enough the Swiss People's Party is arguing that we have these many mosques. Because when you go to Switzerland, you want to hear yodeling. You don't want to hear the call to prayer. So Switzerland overwhelmingly voted no on expanding minarets. Like we're talking like 65, 70%. And the Swiss People's Party took the credit for, going to the streets and mobilizing the people against this. And, once again, this makes it into the news and everybody's all aghast. I can't believe Switzerland is that xenophobic and that nativistic. But about a week later, BBC decided that they were going to conduct their own little survey around Europe. And they went to Italy and Spain and England and France and Austria and Germany and all the other places. And they asked people in the streets, if this thing in Switzerland was put up to a vote in your country, what would you do? Would you vote yes, expand the minarets, or no, limit them? Every single other European country also voted no. Right? I would not vote to expand. In fact, even France said, if possible, like 85% of the respondents said if they could eliminate mosques altogether, they would. So the point to be made here, folks, is that national populist movements kind of tap into sort of the subtle anger that citizens may have about their current state of affairs and their grumblings against what they see as perceived outsiders living in their country. Flemish Bloc for Belgium, National Front for France, Jobbik for Hungary, which at this point Jobbik has almost become a neo-Nazi party. Donald Trump's Make America Great Again campaign, I wouldn't necessarily put the Republican Party in it just yet. The Republicans are still very, very elitist and condescending, but they're smart enough to harness Trump's populism as a way of winning elections. And I'm sorry to say once again that if the November election is between the populism of Trump and the status quo elitism of Biden, I think we're going to see a 2016 repeat all over again. The party Golden Dawn in Greece, it is barely populist at this point. It is really more of a neo-Nazi party. But Golden Dawn was very successful in the years around the Greek economic crisis of 2008 and 2009 in organizing a number of grassroots movements throughout the country to mobilize voters against the austerity measures that were put in place by the European Central Bank. They offered blood drives, food collection agencies. They openly saw themselves as a party that idolized Hezbollah. Right? That's what they kind of wanted to be. They wanted to be a shadow government within Greece that, did for the people what the official government either could not or would not do. And then finally, UKIP, one of the few populist parties that never made it into power, but succeeded in its primary goal. And that was break the United Kingdom away from the European Union, which happened in 2016, if I'm not mistaken. 2016, 2017, I don't remember when it was, but, the UK is now out. They left, what was it? Was it earlier this year, I think? Yes. And so you get the sense that these national populist parties, they're good in the sense of tapping into voter anger, challenging the status quo, and finally getting what they want because they are the only party that does that. Now, I noted that a couple of these parties might be neo-Nazi, and that's not all that surprising because a number of these parties have existed before the 90s, and they might have existed in the 60s, 70s, and 80s as, far more extremist groups, like really on the fringes of, electoral politics. But, for the most part, these parties were kept out of parliament because of the, 5% rule or whatever it is, right? Every country has that threshold voting. So, they would maybe get 2% of the vote, 3% of the vote, and, it was relatively innocuous. But, after 89, 90, when countries began transitioning to more democracy and globalization, sort of opening up all these countries, a lot of these parties kind of saw the advantage that they could make by sort of moderating a little bit, by pandering less to the extreme and more to voter frustration and apathy. Golden Dawn's really a good example of this, right? Golden Dawn's been around since the 1980s, and you look at their early literature, they are just openly Nazi apologetic, right? They're just basically like Hitler, 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 Hitler. Now, the average Greek citizen is not going to get turned on by getting pamphlets in the mail with swastikas all over the damn place. But when the economic downturn happens and more ordinary Greeks begin to realize that the current system is no longer working, these parties step in. But they step in by rearranging themselves as presentable, as polite, as an alternative to the status quo. So, they will continue to hearken to traditional values and uphold, national memories and cultural traditions, but they're going to do so now more within a competitive framework of democracy. So you could kind of almost say that they're fascists that made peace with the democratic process. And if you remember from our lecture on fascism, I kind of hinted that fascism and national populism are similar in scope. The one big difference between the two is that national populists might display traits of fascism, especially with this whole idea of unconventional, redemptive solutions to insurmountable problems, right? Especially when we put the primacy of one group over everybody else. But here's the thing. National populist parties have openly proclaimed they will never abandon the democratic process. They see themselves as the final defenders of democracy. Okay? They love democracy. In fact, if they could, they would have every vote in the country up for a popular referendum. Because the idea with populist parties is if the public were to vote on everything and if the public were to actually have their voices heard for once, the viewpoints of these populist parties would reflect the majority of the public, right? Because they represent the silent majority, right? They proclaim what ordinary people only dare to think in that sense, right? This was the slogan that was used for the Austrian Freedom Party under Jörg Haider. He says what we only think. So he's like finally speaking for all of us, right? And you kind of look at Trump supporters and you ask, why the hell do you like this guy? And they're like, he says it the way that it is. And he speaks for me. Now, again, whether Trump believes in this or not is irrelevant. He knows how to play the game, and he does it quite well. So national populist parties are those that, love democracy. And they also know that more often than not, they're in the opposition. They don't make it into ruling government. And you know what? They're kind of happy to do that. They love to be in the opposition. You want to know why? because they can keep their ideological principles without having to compromise in a coalition, you know? Like, especially in proportional representative systems, national populist parties very easily bypass the X% rule, right? Whether it's 5%, 6%, whatever it happens to be, right? They'll get sometimes 10%, 15%, 20%. But what's even better is that the more virulently right-wing that they are, the more toxic everyone else sees them. So here's where things get even more interesting. They will remain in the opposition, in perpetuity, not because they are not in a position to form a governing coalition, but because no one wants to work with them. And so there is this little feature in parliamentary democracies that I didn't bring up in the first half of class, because I was saving it for now. And that is parties like the ones that I just mentioned before operate outside of this so-called cordon sanitaire. Okay? What exactly is this? This is one more feature here. A cordon sanitaire is, well, it literally means quarantine line, right? Like a sanitary roping off thing. And in parliamentary politics, it sort of functions as a way of preventing the spread of an ideology that is deemed unwanted or dangerous to the politics of the state. So if a party like Golden Dawn or Austrian Freedom Party participates in the elections and they get more than the 5%, their votes are represented in parliament. They are now in parliament. However, there is a final failsafe that can be used to get rid of parties that the threshold voting clause was designed to keep out. And that is cordon sanitaire, which means that all other political parties blackball these guys, right? They say, we're not going to work with you. We're not going to form coalitions with you. We can't ban you because that's unconstitutional. But we are going to do everything in our power to make certain that you don't go any further than this. So don't feel like you're obligated to show up to parliamentary sessions. And if you do, sit in the back of the room, go on Facebook, read a book, whatever. We're going to pretend that you're not there, but please do your best to also don't interrupt us. We can't deny you the seats, but we're just going to pretend that you don't exist. Now, if you're a party that gets, 6, 7, 8% of the vote, you can be ignored. But in a lot of these cases, folks, these parties get 15, 20, maybe even 25% of the votes. How are you going to form a coalition around that? You oftentimes have to form these unwieldy governing coalitions with 3, sometimes even 4 political parties. And that makes governing very, very, very difficult. And the populist parties can sit there and they can stick to their roots. And they can say, cool, you want to work around me? You knock yourself out. But let's see how long this government lasts. You're making compromises with 3 or 4 parties. Just, you know what? We can turn to our own audience and say, you see what these guys are doing? You see how they're trying to keep us out of power? You see how they're going out of their way? They're tripping over themselves to effectively block us, And look, if you want to make a American comparison, take a look at what happened a week ago, just before Super Tuesday. The DNC forces all of these other Democratic candidates out of the race. Candidates that I have to admit had a far better chance of advancing beyond Biden, but they chose Biden as the person. Buttigieg is out. Klobuchar is out. Yang is out. Cory Booker is out. And and Kamala is out. All of a sudden, they all back Biden, right? Is it because Biden is the stronger candidate? No. But they are cordon sanitaring Sanders, right? They're cordon sanitaring Bernie. That doesn't mean that Bernie is right-wing populist, right? But he's a threat to the Democratic establishment, okay? So cordon sanitaire is sort of like an unofficial way of blocking one faction from gaining any more traction or trying to gain any more traction. And so, in this sense, folks, national populist parties enjoy being the backseat driver because they gain popularity by protesting and opposing everything that the incumbent status quo governments do. And look, it is very easy and very lucrative for you to gain votes by being the party of no, right? No to globalization, right? Globalization opens up our borders, floods our country with immigrants, moves our jobs overseas, eliminates whatever local industries that we have. They're bought out by McDonald's and Mercedes and Walmart, and pretty soon we're just going to become just another distribution center for Amazon. No to the European Union, right? The European Union is an unaccountable, unassailable organization that forces states to give up elements of their sovereignty and their national decision making. And, we're a small country that needs all hands on deck at the Capitol. No to the United States, right? The United States is the rogue cowboy in the world. We're not getting ourselves involved in your foreign entanglements. We don't want your military base on our country, on our country's soil. No to immigration. Right? Immigrants are those that don't follow our laws or abide by our traditions, and we have to cater to their whims. Otherwise, we're seen as racists. And, national populists will always start every sentence with, "I'm not a racist, but," right? And those are always good ones to listen to. No to secular progressivism. Hey, I hate to break it to you. This country is Christian, founded on Christian values. We say Merry Christmas, not Happy Holidays, not Season's Greetings. It is not a holiday tree. It's a Christmas tree. I want Santa Claus and snowflakes on my Starbucks cup, and screw you for trying to deny it otherwise. No to international law over state law. No to foreign entanglements. No to what these parties see as capitulation after capitulation of neoliberal governments over the past 20 to 30 years that has all but decimated the sovereignty and the national decision-making of the country for global transnational corporations. Right? It has enriched some people and it has impoverished others. It has turned the country into a client state of greater powers and greater corporations. And so in this case, when people finally ask these parties, well, then what are you? And this is where things get a little fuzzy because they're much more adamant about saying what they're against than what they're for. But they'll just, they'll tell you that they're against the current status quo. They don't really have any long-term goals and objectives beyond just simply envisioning a country 10, 20 years down the road where everybody is speaking their own language and marrying in traditional folk costumes and going to church and having, 5, 10 kids or whatever it is, right? But, what they are is they're largely they're against the neoliberal status quo. Even though right-wing populist parties are not necessarily anti-capitalist. Right? They're not calling for the elimination of capitalism. They just want capitalism to exist within the country itself. They don't want to be beholden to anyone else. National populist parties are also anti-intellectual. This is an interesting term here. It doesn't mean that they're pro-stupidity, okay, even though some Trump voters would have you think otherwise. But anti-intellectualism is, it's a way of thinking in which there's a difference between being intelligent and being an intellectual, right? And I'm sure you can figure out the difference here. Someone who is intelligent might not necessarily have the schooling, the diploma, the degree in that sense, right? But they know how to change a tire. They know how to, fix a car engine. They know how to unclog a toilet. They know how to, bake. They know how to take care of themselves and their families. Whereas the intellectual will, sit in their lofty offices, their academic departments. They'll write for their New York Times op-eds, wondering what's the matter with Kansas? Why are these people so stupid? When the populists will say, there's nothing stupid about us. We're winning elections left and right. You people seem to just not know what the hell is going on. Anti-intellectualism speaks for the people, right? The people who don't necessarily reside in trendy, high-priced urban centers, okay? These are the people that live in Staten Island, right? Not Dumbo, not Williamsburg, right? These are the people that live in the working class neighborhoods of Queens, not Chelsea or Soho or, what's that place? Chelsea, the High Line, whatever it is, right? Right? They're not members of the privileged class. These are people who, are struggling to survive, but they're proud of who they are, and they feel that there's a greater sense of community and morality among these people than these high-end, Botox-seeking celebutants in that sense. So, they're basically like, we don't need no snot-nosed, elitist opinion piece about us, because at the end of the day, I can kick your ass and you wouldn't even know what happens, that type of thing, right? It's America, basically. It's America. And look, let me tell you something. I don't identify with America. I'm kind of afraid of America, but I respect America, and I understand America's organization. America's got money. America has got organization. America has got grassroots activism, and America is winning election after election in this country. And again, if the Dems go with Biden, America is going to bury him in that sense. So it really is this rage from below that, rails against internationalism, intellectualism, cosmopolitanism. It advocates kinship through blood, right? Not the whole jus solis form of citizenship, but jus sanguinis. And that is, a type of bonding, a type of community by people who identify by a certain ethnic, racial, religious, and national identity. So foreigners get out. Foreigners get out, immigrants get out, or better yet, you don't have to leave, but you follow our laws. You speak our language, you deal with our customs, right? That's sort of the whole thing. So they're advocates of a number of things, okay? Even though, again, like I said, there is there's little substance within this because, they rarely get this far. They're good at protesting what goes on. But like I said, when you ask them what they want, they become a little bit more abstract. So they're advocates of direct democracy. Okay, they're advocates of direct democracy. They're not a fan of this representative stuff, right? They're always saying, let the voice of the real people be heard, right? Let's have a referendum on whether or not we want to be part of the EU. Let's have a referendum on whether we want to acknowledge the presence of an official language. Let's let the people vote. And the best part about this is that they know that the establishment is going to be opposed to this. Because the establishment will be like, well, we don't have time, we don't have money, we don't have this, we have that. Populists respond by saying, you see, folks, they don't want to hear your voice. They're trying to keep you down. They're fearful of you. They're also advocates of traditional authority over the rational legal. So, even though, they want to adhere to some kind of constitutional thing, and, in the United States, American national populists just go nuts over the Constitution, although parts of it, they overlook others. They are, at the end of the day, advocates of traditional authority over rational legal, right? In other words, this is how we've always done it, and this is how it always should be done. This is how my father did it, this is how I'm doing it, and this is how my children are going to be doing it, whatever it happens to be. They call for clean, fair, and accountable government, which again is a great way of juxtaposing the unruly, unfair, corrupt, decadent, oligarchic swamp that needs to be drained wherever the capital happens to be. And of course, they feel that this can only be achieved if they are in power, right? Because they speak for the voice of the true people. But in order to get that to happen, and here is where sometimes the mask comes off, because a lot of times when they present themselves to the voter, the unaware voter, there's a great sense of attraction to these guys because they are a breath of alternative air. But at the end of the day, national populist parties do promote a sense of authoritative democracy. Again, this type of Tocquevillian rule of the majority. If we are the majority, then we get our way. No more compromise, no more minority deference, none of that stuff. Okay, we have stuff that needs to get done. We've got red tape that needs to be plowed through. We need solutions that need quick, decisive answers right now. We love executive action, right? We love executive authority in this sense. And we will voluntarily choose to submit unwavering and unquestioning patriotism to the state and any movement that operates in the name of that state. So, yeah, there are some latent elements of soft-core fascism in national populist movements. Remember, they stay within the concept of democracy, but it is something that, their more extreme elements, if pushed in one way, would certainly favor greater degrees of national security if it meant compromising civil liberties, at least for the short term. Now, whether that's returned at some point is a different story. Okay? All right. That basically covers our understanding of national populism. We have gone through enough isms at this point. Okay? So if you have made it this far, you are armed and you are ready to go for the first of our case studies next week, which is Venezuela. Once again, I keep thinking that this is going to be the last time that I'm going to teach this country, and it still remains in the news. So stay tuned, and let's see if we can apply some of these isms to our three countries.